We live in an age of political polarization and preference bubbles, of economic change, rising threats, and a rapidly changing world. Canada needs to stay relevant. We need more smart conversations. We need to dive into critical issues and big ideas with passion and unrestrained optimism. I'm Erin O'Toole. Welcome to the Blue Skies Podcast.
Welcome to the Blue Skies Podcast. I'm Erin O'Toole. And I started the Blue Skies Podcast 5 years ago because I said in the age of Twitter or X, social media, we needed more serious, long-form discussions of important issues facing Canada, facing the world. And we needed to do that in sometimes a bipartisan fashion. And Blue Skies now back after my political career. We're going to keep that up. And we're going to have a bipartisan Blue Skies, so a bit of blue skies with a bit of red hues on the horizon. I'm very happy to have the Honorable John McKay join us today. Welcome to Blue Skies, John.
Well, thank you, Erin, and we'll see how much of a red tinge this Blue Skies podcast has by the end.
Well, listen, you're someone I had immense respect for. We would enjoy trading barbs. But for the Canadians that aren't familiar with your career, it's an impressive one. John was a lawyer before he was elected to Parliament, quite active in the real estate bar in Ontario, including the Durham bar. I used to think I was I thought I was the Durham guy, but clearly you have some credibility there too. John was elected in 1997. He is approaching 30 years, 27 years in public life. In the governments of Chrétien and Martin, he served as critic in a range of roles and as parliamentary secretary to finance and to national defense. He served as chair of the National Defense Committee of Public Safety and National Security. He sat as the lead on the Canadian section of the Canadian Joint Permanent Board of Defense. He's successfully passed a few private members' bills, one on health, dealing with smoking, and one dealing with foreign aid and accountability for Canadian dollars going to alleviate poverty. He's been a long champion of responsible business practices for the extractives industry. He and I have jousted on this issue for a time, but he's talked about corporate social responsibility, ESG before it was ESG, for a couple of decades now. And John's efforts were really a large portion behind the success of S211 in last spring, passing in Parliament, which is going to place restrictions and track foreign labor practices that involve slave labor, child labor, unfair labor practices. That's what we're going to talk about today. But John, you've been in office a long time. Are you running again?
Yeah. Or you get the easy question right off the top, or you're just getting rid of it. Yes. Only the Lord knows, and He hasn't revealed it to me yet.
Well, when you get that divine intervention, come on the Blue Skies and talk about it. But
I think given the polls, we might need divine intervention.
Well, I know better than anyone that an eternity can, or a day can be an eternity in politics. And for us, it was the final weekend of the campaign. The polls shifted a little bit in a negative way for me. But your long work on the extractive sector, John. Talk about where that came from, because, I used to say to you when I was the Carl Secretary for Trade and was trying to sort of say, Canada can't trace around the world what people are doing, but we can encourage responsible conduct. The mining sector, finance in Toronto, you were kind of in that mix. It's important for our economy. Why was this an issue that was important for you to advance?
Well, clearly I was not the poster boy of the mining industry for a long time. And why? I think I'll bring it back to faith background. I'm, as you know, I want to say a born again capitalist. I'm not quite there, but I'm a big believer in the free market. But even the free market has rules, and the free market cannot use slave labor, it cannot use forced labor, it cannot use environmental practices that in any other situation would degrade our own environment. So why should we foist it on others? So that's the motivation, and it's true that I've been at this for a while. Sometimes you learn more from glorious failures than you learn from successes. So one of the ones was C300, and I don't know. I don't remember whether you were around at the time or not, but I was pretty sure I had the vote count on C300, and then there was a stampede to the washroom just as the vote was being called, and I lost by 6 votes. Oh gosh! So the lobbying efforts of the mining industry paid off. And interestingly, I thought the issue was frankly dead and buried when we lost the vote, but it became an election issue in 2011, and was kept alive by universities and various other groups, way beyond what I could do. But I do my little circuit around to various people who would listen to me, which was not a big circuit, may I say. And it started, as I say, take a life of its own. In 2015, the Liberal Party at least had committed to implementing that kind of legislation. Then there's another story to get to where we are today, but that's how it stayed alive.
The original bill was in '08 and '09. It was before my time, but I reviewed it when I became Parliamentary Secretary for Trade and had the extractives file. And we were pushing an issue you might recall called economic diplomacy, where we tried to get the corporate sector, global affairs, or DFATE as it was then, and groups like World Vision and other organizations to work together. And I looked to some of your work. So in many ways, you laid the groundwork for what we're looking at now.
If I look back over the 10 or 15 year span, I think politically we've shifted significantly. I think socially we've shifted significantly, and it's no longer the CSR department of any large corporation is kind of an irrelevancy. It's now central to business practices, and so I think our society has evolved, and I think it's in the right direction.
I think the debate you started really led a lot of mining companies and other players in the resource sector to create corporate social responsibility programs and to really audit and check what they were doing around the world so often, because obviously they raise money in the Toronto Stock Exchange. They have the corporate leadership in Canada, but sometimes when you're operating in far corners of the world, you start using local contractors. You're paying for them. They're your agents,
right,
from a legal standpoint.